Tom Baker's first three seasons as the Fourth Doctor are often regarded not just as the peak of classic Doctor Who, but one of the high points of the programme's entire history. It was an era where almost everything that defines a great Doctor Who story seemed to fall into place. Performances, storytelling, atmosphere, and even some of the production values for the time all worked in harmony under the leadership of producer Philip Hinchcliffe and script editor Robert Holmes. The result was a bold, confident run of stories that captured audiences and delivered some of the highest ratings the show had ever seen. But all good things must come to an end, and this era came to a halt far more abruptly than many might have expected. These seasons leaned heavily into gothic horror, jump scares, and moments of implied violence, elements that drew the attention of campaigner Mary Whitehouse and the National Viewers and Listeners Association. Their concern was that Doctor Who had drifted too far from its family-friendly roots and was no longer suitable for younger viewers. Regardless of personal opinion, these complaints reached the upper levels of the BBC, and following the conclusion of season 14, changes were inevitable. Philip Hinchcliffe was moved on to the adult-orientated police drama Target, while Doctor Who would instead be handed to its new producer, Graham Williams. The remit for season 15 was clear: tone down the violence, and reposition Doctor Who as a family-orientated programme once again. What followed was a season that many felt paled in comparison to what came before. Horror and menace were replaced with humour and satire, while the visual presentation of the show was increasingly criticised as cheap or lightweight. Is that a fair assessment? What was happening behind the scenes that shaped, and at times hindered, Graham Williams' first season at the helm? And does season 15 truly deserve its reputation, or has it been judged too harshly when viewed without its wider context? So let's revisit one of the most transitional and challenging periods in Doctor Who's history, and ask the question: is season 15 the show's most misunderstood season? As already discussed, before season 15 even began, Doctor Who underwent a significant changing of the guard behind the scenes. The most high-profile departure was that of producer Philip Hinchcliffe, with Graham Williams stepping in to replace him. However, one could argue that an even greater influence on the Fourth Doctor's first three seasons was script editor Robert Holmes. While Hinchcliffe oversaw the production, it was Holmes who shaped much of the era's tone, particularly its fascination with gothic horror. Robert Holmes wasn't just a script editor, he was also a prolific writer, and arguably one of the finest Doctor Who has ever had. Between seasons 12 and 14, he not only oversaw the scripts, but also wrote 3 stories himself, a rarity for a script editor at the time. And beyond that, he contributed extensive rewrites to numerous other stories, often uncredited or under pseudonyms. Even before becoming script editor, Holmes' writing frequently leaned into horror and macabre themes, so it might seem inevitable that alongside Hinchcliffe, he too would be removed from the show. But that wasn't quite the case. Robert Holmes' departure was not forced but voluntary. He felt he'd taken the role of script editor as far as he could. However, given the scale of change already underway with the new producer, he was persuaded to remain temporarily and gradually hand over the reins to his successor, Anthony Reid, a transition that would in itself present a number of problems. On screen, season 15 would also mark the final season for Leela, with Louise Jameson choosing to leave the role midway through filming the season. Introduced partway through season 14 in The Face of Evil, Leela was very much a product of the Hinchcliffe era. Her savage upbringing, comfort with violence, and reliance on weapons fitting neatly into the darker tone of the time. With Doctor Who now moving towards a lighter, more family-orientated direction, it's easy to see why the character began to feel out of place. And yet, season 15 still offered plenty of potential to develop Leela further, particularly through an almost Eliza Doolittle-style arc, with the Doctor guiding her away from her brutal origins. But perhaps the most telling addition of season 15 was the introduction of K9. First appearing in The Invisible Enemy, the robotic dog would become a fixture for the remainder of the Tom Baker era. For Graham Williams, K9 represented a conscious effort to reconnect Doctor Who with younger audiences, precisely the remit handed down to him by the BBC hierarchy. With key figures departing, new creative voices stepping in, and clear ideological shifts both on and off screen, the stage was now set. Work could finally begin on defining what kind of season and what kind of Doctor Who season 15 was going to be. One of the biggest misconceptions about season 15 is that it represents an instant tonal shift in Doctor Who. When people think of this period, and of Graham Williams' tenure more broadly, they often picture the Fourth Doctor breaking the fourth wall, becoming increasingly eccentric, and leaning heavily into comedy. But that isn't how season 15 actually unfolded. The change in tone is gradual. The early part of the season still carries clear hangovers from the Hinchcliffe era, with the shift towards humour and satire only becoming more pronounced as the season progresses. One reason for this slow transition lies behind the scenes, particularly in the handover of script editing duties from Robert Holmes to Anthony Reid. Normally, ideas for the next season would be developed while the current one was still on air, but season 14 placed enormous demands on Holmes. Alongside his script editing duties, he also wrote two of that season's most significant stories, The Deadly Assassin and The Towns of Wen Chiang. By the end of the season, he was exhausted and simply hadn't had the opportunity to fully plan ahead for season 15. As a result, Holmes remaining in place temporarily to oversee the transition ensured the new season could get off the ground. To build momentum, Holmes script edited the first three stories of season 15 and relied on trusted writers, Terrance Dicks, Bob Baker and Dave Martin, and Chris Boucher. The results were Horror of Fang Rock, The Invisible Enemy, and Image of the Fendahl. Both Fang Rock and Fendahl draw heavily from Gothic storytelling traditions, and tonally wouldn't feel out of place in the Hinchcliffe era, albeit with the violence noticeably toned down. These stories act as a bridge between eras, allowing the season to find its footing before the tone begins to evolve more noticeably. It's only in that second half of the season 15 that the shift becomes more clearer. With Anthony Reid now fully in charge, the show leans in more openly into satire, beginning with The Sunmakers, ironically written by Robert Holmes himself. The season then concludes with Underworld and The Invasion of Time, stories that fully showcase the more eccentric, erratic side of the Fourth Doctor, particularly in how the narratives are built around his unpredictable behaviour. There's also a noticeable shift in setting and genre. Whilst Horror of Fang Rock and Image of the Fendahl ground their horror in gothic, often earth-based threats, the remaining stories lean more heavily into science fiction concepts. Futuristic dystopias and alien worlds replace familiar environments, shifting audience attention away from the homegrown menace and towards spectacle and ideas instead. On the surface, then, season 15 appears to have successfully navigated the tonal transition demanded by the BBC hierarchy. The violence was reduced, the humour was increased, and the show had moved closer to its family-friendly remit. But beneath that surface, significant problems were still brewing. Under normal circumstances, as we know, a Doctor Who production team would enter a new season with a healthy slate of potential stories before narrowing them down to the final lineup. Season 15 didn't have that luxury. As previously mentioned, Robert Holmes' heavy workload on season 14 meant planning for the following year was already behind schedule. But matters were made worse when two stories were dropped very late in development, each for very different reasons, forcing the production team into last-minute problem-solving. One of the earliest casualties was a story by Terrance Dicks. Although he ultimately opened the season with Horror of Fang Rock, this wasn't his original pitch. That story would have been The Vampire Mutations, a gothic tale that would have seen the Doctor and Leela confronting vampires, firmly rooted in the horror tradition of the Philip Hinchcliffe era. Ironically, the production team were willing to proceed with this, but the BBC had just greenlit a high-profile adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, starring Louis Jourdan as the title role, and didn't want Doctor Who's Saturday teen time slot muddying the waters with a competing vampire story. As a result, Dicks was forced to abandon the idea and produce a replacement at short notice. The result was Horror of Fang Rock, and, in my view, it perfectly demonstrates what Doctor Who could achieve when creative pressure was channeled effectively. Terrance Dicks' experience with the show allowed him to construct a story built around minimal characters, limited location, and a monster that required restrained effects. Set almost entirely within a lighthouse at the turn of the 20th century, Horror of Fang Rock feels like a direct continuation of the towns of Wen Chiang, both in its period setting and the Doctor's ongoing attempts to expose Leela to Earth's history. The introduction of the Routons, long mentioned but previously unseen enemies of the Sontarans, neatly ties into existing continuity, while their shape-shifting ability limits the need for expensive creatures. The story structure, a small group slowly being picked off in a confined space, leans heavily into the classic base under siege format, but executed on one of its smallest and most effective scales. The result is atmospheric, suspenseful, and claustrophobic. For me, it's one of Tom Baker's strongest stories. However, while Horror of Fang Rock succeeds brilliantly, it also feels like a farewell to the gothic horror of the Philip Hinchcliffe era, rather than a statement of intent for what Graham Williams' era would become. It's a strong opener, but it's not a roadmap. Interestingly, Terrance Dicks's abandoned idea won't stay dead for long. 3 years later, under producer John Nathan Turner, the vampire mutations was resurrected and reworked into State of Decay, finally giving us that vampire-themed Fourth Doctor story, albeit much later than intended. So if Horror of Fang Rock shows how last-minute changes could lead to creative success, the season finale, The Invasion of Time, shows the risks of that same approach. Like Horror of Fang Rock, it replaced another dropped story, David Weir's Killers of the Dark. Set on Gallifrey and featuring a race of cat-like humanoids, the concept was deemed impossible to realise convincingly on a Doctor Who budget. One proposed scene even involved a gladiatorial arena filled with these new species. Impressive on paper, but entirely impractical for 1970s television. With time running out and no opportunity to commission a new writer, Graham Williams and Anthony Reid took matters into their own hands, scripting The Invasion of Time under the pseudonym of David Agnew. The Gallifrey setting was retained, but the story shifted focus to the Vardans, a race supposedly manipulating the Doctor in facilitating their invasion, before abruptly pivoting to the return of the Centaurans. While the story feels epic and explores genuinely interesting ideas about Doctor's relationship with his own people, its execution is far less convincing. The Vardans are poorly visualised. The Centauran inclusion feels bolted on to raise stakes, and the narrative, like a casualty of its rushed development, often feels padded with repetitive or overtly comedic dialogue. This rushed nature is perhaps best exemplified by Leela's departure, where she abruptly decides to remain on Gallifrey after falling in love with Andred, a decision that feels entirely out of character and underdeveloped. 6-part stories during Tom Baker's era were rare, usually reserved for landmark events. Genesis of the Daleks, The Seeds of Doom, and The Talents of Wen Chiang all justified their length with tight narratives and strong production values. By comparison, The Invasion of Time struggles to live up to that legacy, particularly given that it was never intended to fill that role in the first place. What further complicates matters is its perceived status as a follow-up to The Deadly Assassin. Both stories are set on Gallifrey and explore the Doctor's uneasy relationship with the Time Lords, even revisiting the idea of claiming the role of Lord President. But where The Deadly Assassin feels focused and radical, The Invasion of Time feels compromised, a story trying to be epic while fighting against time, budget, and circumstance. And that contrast is crucial. Season 15 wasn't undone by bad ideas, it was undone by how and when those ideas were forced into production. Classic Doctor Who was always wrestling with limited budgets, constantly trying to translate ambitious ideas in something visually convincing. But season 15 arguably saw the show struggle financially more than it had for some time. In the past, budgetary issues usually stem from one or two things: declining popularity leading to reduced funding, or overspending on certain stories leaving less money for others. While it's true that some stories in season 15 received a larger share of the budget than others, there is a much bigger factor at play here, one completely outside the control of the production team. That was the British economy. The mid to late 1970s were an extremely difficult period economically, and by 1977 inflation had risen to about 16%. In simple terms, everything cost more. And crucially for Doctor Who, the budgets the show traditionally operated under no longer stretched anywhere near as far as they once had. This problem hit Doctor Who particularly hard because of how the show was produced. Unlike many other BBC programmes of the era, Doctor Who couldn't rely on a small number of reusable sets. Apart from the TARDIS interior, virtually every story required brand new sets, costumes, models, visual effects, and location filming. Compare that to other BBC shows at the time, like Porridge or Are You Being Served? Or Dad's Army, which were largely confined to a handful of standing sets that could be reused week after week. Doctor Who simply didn't have that luxury. Every new world came with a new bill. This financial pressure reached a breaking point towards the end of season 15, particularly with the penultimate story, Underworld. Underworld was designed to be shot studio-bound and required multiple elaborate sets, most notably the spacecraft R1C and the planet P7E, which was meant to be represented by extensive cave and cavern environments. It quickly became apparent that there simply wasn't enough money to build all the necessary sets and still have sufficient budget left to mount the six-piece finale, The Invasion of Time. Faced with that reality, the production team turned to a technique that had largely fallen out of favour by this point: CSO, or Colour Separation Overlay. Introduced during the Third Doctor era, CSO allowed actors to be filmed against a single colour backdrop, usually a blue or green, with model sets or images added in later. While it had once been an effective solution, the technique clearly had limitations, and its use had been significantly reduced during the Tom Baker early years. In Underworld, however, CSO was used extensively to depict the caves of P7E. The result is unmistakable. The scenes feel flat, artificial, and two-dimensional, with characters often appearing disconnected from their environments. It's one of the most visually criticised stories of the Fourth Doctor era, and for understandable reasons. The upside was that this compromise allowed Underworld to be completed while preserving enough budget to produce The Invasion of Time, but the cost was reputational. Underworld quickly became shorthand for Doctor Who at its cheapest looking, and over time it came to symbolise a broader perception that season 15 and the Graham Williams early tenure represented a decline in production quality. But that perception isn't exactly fair. What Underworld really represents isn't creative laziness or poor leadership, but a production team making difficult decisions in the face of economic realities that they couldn't control. Faced with rising costs and static budgets, something had to give, and in season 15 it was visual ambition that took the hit. Understanding that context doesn't magically make Underworld look better, but it does help explain why it looks the way it does, and why season 15 struggles can't be laid solely at the feet of its new producer. So, with all these influences and hindrances placed upon the production team, what stories did season 15 actually give us? And more importantly, do they represent a noticeable drop in quality compared to what had become the standard during the Fourth Doctor's era so far? As already discussed, the season opens with Horror of Fang Rock, a clear nod to the Philip Hinchcliffe era, and one that plays perfectly to the limitations it was created under. With a confined setting, a small cast, and a suspense-driven narrative, it's a masterclass in doing more with less. Rather than relying on overt violence or jump scares, the story builds atmosphere gradually, and it works remarkably well. I'd happily recommend it to anyone who hasn't yet seen it. That said, Horror of Fang Rock doesn't define the overall mood of season 15. If anything, it feels more like a final farewell to that gothic era than a statement of what's to come. The next story you get is The Invisible Enemy, which was actually the first story recorded for the season. Here we get a clear indication of the show's new direction. The emphasis shifts more heavily towards science fiction, the dialogue becomes noticeably more tongue-in-cheek, and the story's multiple studio-bound settings immediately begin to strain the budget. This wasn't helped by the timing. Earlier that year, Star Wars had been released, fundamentally reshaping public expectations of science fiction visuals across film and television. An unfair comparison for Doctor Who, perhaps, but an unavoidable one. Narratively, The Invisible Enemy is inventive, a sentient virus infecting the Doctor, the crew of a spacecraft, and a medical centre, combined with the Doctor and Leela being cloned and miniaturised to journey inside his own body, is classic high-concept Who. Unfortunately, the execution lets it down. The nucleus of the swarm is underwhelming, resembling, rather unfortunately, a despondent prawn. Ultimately, though, the story is remembered less for its plot and more for the introduction of K9. Originally conceived as a one-off, the cost of the prop and its obvious appeal to younger viewers ensured K9 became a permanent fixture, and one of the most iconic companions in the show's history was born. The third story, Image of the Fendahl, represents Doctor Who's final loosening its grip on gothic horror rather than clinging onto it. Centred around a human skull that shouldn't exist, that's part of a gestalt lifeform feeding on human energy, the story contains all the ingredients of a classic horror: cult worship, witchcraft, life-draining entities, and an atmosphere thick with dread. Its effectiveness is enhanced by something relatively rare for classic Who: nighttime location filming. Shot at the Stargrove estate, also used for Pyramids of Mars, the story benefits enormously from its setting. While it doesn't quite reach the heights of the Hinchcliffe era classics, it stands as arguably the last time Doctor Who fully embraced gothic horror in this way. The Sunmakers marks the true turning point of season 15. This is where Robert Holmes officially hands over the script editing duties to Anthony Reid, although for this story they effectively co-piloted the role. Despite being written by Robert Holmes, The Sunmakers abandons horror entirely in favour of satire, specifically a biting parody of the British tax system, inspired by Holmes' own frustrations with the inland revenue. Set on Pluto, now a human colony powered by multiple suns, the story depicts an oppressive corporate regime taxing its citizens into misery. The Doctor responds by inciting a revolution. While the themes are surprisingly adult, including economic exploitation and even implied suicide, the story is packaged as something playful and entertaining. This represents the best case scenario for Graham Williams' vision: serious ideas presented in a lighter, more accessible way. Unfortunately, not all stories during his tenure would strike this balance quite as well. Underworld, which we've already discussed at length, suffers heavily from its reliance on CSO and the visual limitations imposed by the budget. But in truth, the effects aren't actually its biggest problem. The story, the second season 15 offering from Bob Baker and Dave Martin, marks the first Fourth Doctor story with no involvement whatsoever from Robert Holmes. By this point, Gothic horror had completely vanished, replaced by a narrative heavily inspired by Greek mythology, particularly Jason and the Golden Fleece. On paper, science fiction filtered through mythological storytelling is an intriguing concept. But for me, Underworld fails not because of how it looks, but because of how it feels. It starts with promise, but quickly becomes formulaic and dull. Baker and Martin were prolific contributors throughout the 1970s, often seen as dependable writers who could deliver on schedule and accommodate production requests. But that reliability sometimes came at the expense of ambition. While The Three Doctors remains their high point, Underworld is, in my view, one of their weakest offerings. And finally, we come to The Invasion of Time. As discussed earlier, its rushed development and lack of polish prevent it from standing alongside the great six-part epics of the Tom Baker era. And yet, despite its flaws, it's an oddly enjoyable story, and one that perhaps best encapsulates the Graham Williams era. What's most interesting here is the Doctor's performance. His apparent portrayal of Gallifrey, allowing the Vardens to invade while seemingly acting out of spite, is revealed as an elaborate deception. The Doctor fools his enemies, the Time Lords, and even Leela. Seeing the Doctor convincingly perform villainy highlights just how powerful his reputation is within the universe. And once again, it's Tom Baker's commitment that elevates the material. His ability to bounce between menace, comedy, and bombast lifts not only the Invasion of Time, but many stories across this era. So yes, Season 15 is very much a mixed bag, not just in terms of quality, but in the kinds of story it tells. Gothic horror, claustrophobic suspense, sharp satire, and lighter science fiction all sit side by side. Which brings us to the final question. Is Season 15 truly misunderstood, or is its uneven reputation entirely deserved? I'm going to dive straight in and be honest. Season 15 isn't as strong as any of the 3 seasons produced under Philip Hinchcliffe. I think that's fairly obvious to most fans. But by acknowledging that still doesn't answer the fundamental question. Is Season 15 misunderstood, or is it simply flawed? To answer that, I think we need to detach ourselves from direct comparison. Season 15 wasn't trying to be another Hinchcliffe season. Graham Williams was brought in with a clear mandate to soften the tone of Doctor Who and make it more family-friendly. In that regard, he succeeded. But he was also clearly wary of alienating the show's established audience, which helps explain why the transition in tone was gradual rather than abrupt, with remnants of Gothic horror lingering early into the part of the season. If you look purely at the concepts and plot lines across Season 15, there's no lack of ambition or imagination. The problem isn't a shortage of ideas, it's that so many external factors work against the production team that fully realising those ideas was often impossible. Should those ambitions have been scaled back? I don't think so. If anything, the scale and confidence of the Hinchcliffe era would have encouraged Graham Williams to believe similar ambition was not only possible, but expected. The barriers facing season 15 were significant. Budget constraints, last-minute rewrites, and shifting personnel all took their toll. And had even some of these issues not occurred, the season might not have been remembered very differently. In fact, you could argue that part of what made the Philip Hinchcliffe era so successful wasn't just strong writing and casting, but a degree of good fortune. The absence of the kind of sustained production difficulties that would later plague the Williams era. And this wasn't limited to season 15. Graham Williams' entire tenure was marked by recurring challenges, shrinking budgets, strikes, and continual changes behind the scenes. By contrast, the Philip Hinchcliffe era appears relatively smooth and stable. Because of this, I think Graham Williams' achievements are often undervalued. Horror of Fang Rock and Image of the Fendahl could comfortably sit within the Hinchcliffe era, and The Sun Makers remains one of Doctor Who's sharpest pieces of satire. Beyond season 15, Williams would also oversee The Key to Time, Doctor Who's first full season story arc, and City of Death, one of the most beloved stories of the classic era. Yes, there are low points, particularly where the budget becomes painfully visible, but many of those issues were simply beyond Graham Williams' control. To me, he comes across as a producer with genuine ambition and creativity, one repeatedly let down by financial limitations rather than that lack of vision. When Graham Williams left in 1980 and was replaced by John Nathan Turner, his successor was openly critical, suggesting that the show had become tired and the budget had become poorly managed. While I agree that Doctor Who needed refreshing as it entered the 1980s, I do think those criticisms were, at least initially, somewhat short-sighted, especially given the production difficulties John Nathan Turner would soon face himself. Amid all of this, season 15 also highlights just how vital Tom Baker was to the show. As Doctor Who shifted from gothic horror towards lighter, more comedic storytelling, that tonal change had to be reflected through the Doctor himself. Baker rose to the challenge. His performances often elevate material that might otherwise have struggled, to the point where the production's limitations are, at times, barely noticeable. Of course, the downside of this was Baker knew just how much the show relied on him. His growing influence behind the scenes would eventually lead to conflicts with writers, directors, and production staff, an issue that would become more pronounced as the era continued. So, is season 15 misunderstood or flawed? In my view, it's totally misunderstood. Not because it's secretly brilliant or unfairly maligned, but because the scale of the challenges it faced is rarely given enough weight. Given those constraints, it's hard to imagine the season achieving much more than what it actually did. It completed the tonal transition demanded by the BBC, navigated a minefield of production difficulties, and still delivered a season that's inventive, varied, and often engaging. But that's just my take. Let me know what you think. Am I being too kind to season 15 and Graham Williams? Could more have been done? Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.